At 8:15 a.m., the morning routine in Hiroshima was ordinary. People were commuting to work. Children were walking to school. Shop owners were opening doors. Air raid sirens had sounded earlier, but nothing followed. The all-clear had been given. Life resumed. Then, without warning, the sky turned white. In less than a second, a single weapon released more energy than any bomb ever used before. The city did not explode outward, it collapsed inward. Heat, light, pressure, and radiation arrived simultaneously. There was no time to react. What happened next was not simply an attack. It was a transformation of warfare itself. This video is not about assigning simple blame or offering easy moral answers. It is about understanding why the United States used atomic weapons, what decision-makers believed at the time, and what those choices unleashed immediately and for generations. Because the bomb did not just end a war. It created a future that humanity still lives inside. And to understand that future, we have to go back to the world of 1945, a world exhausted by violence, fear, and uncertainty. Please like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment the next video topic in the comments. By the summer of 1945, the United States was facing a problem no nation had ever faced before. The war in Europe was over. Nazi Germany had surrendered. Crowds filled the streets in celebration. But in the Pacific, the war dragged on, brutal, unresolved, and increasingly desperate. To understand why the United States used the atomic bomb, we have to step inside the mindset of American leaders at that exact moment in history, not with hindsight, but with the information, fear, and pressure they were living under in real time. Because from their perspective, the war was not ending. It was hardening, a war that refused to end. Japan's position in mid-1945 was militarily hopeless, but psychologically unyielding. Its navy had been shattered. Its air force was largely destroyed. American submarines were strangling supply lines. Strategic bombing had reduced major cities to ash. Yet surrender did not come. Instead, Japanese leadership prepared for what they believed would be the final, decisive battle, not just between armies, but between entire populations. This mindset shocked American planners. On island after island, U.S. forces encountered resistance that defied conventional military logic. Soldiers fought to the death. Surrender was rare. Civilians were often caught in the fighting, sometimes coerced into participation. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were turning points, not because they were victories, but because they revealed the future. On Iwo Jima, nearly the entire Japanese garrison died. On Okinawa, over 100,000 civilians were killed, many by suicide or crossfire. American commanders began asking a terrifying question. If this is how Japan defends distant islands, what happens when we land on the home islands? Operation Downfall, the invasion that loomed. The planned invasion of Japan was called Operation Downfall, and it was already underway in preparation. This was not a vague concept. It was scheduled, mapped, and supplied. The invasion would unfold in two massive phases. First, Operation Olympic, targeting southern Japan. Then Operation Coronet, a full-scale assault on the Tokyo region. Military intelligence estimated that Japan could mobilize millions of soldiers and millions of civilians. Men, women, teenagers, and the elderly were being trained to resist invasion using rifles, explosives, and even sharpened bamboo spears. American planners were deeply shaken by these reports. Casualty projections varied, but none were optimistic. Even conservative estimates predicted hundreds of thousands of American casualties. Some projections reached into the millions, especially when factoring in disease, starvation, and prolonged urban combat. Japanese casualties were expected to be far worse. From the U.S. perspective, the invasion of Japan was shaping up to be the bloodiest military operation in human history. The political pressure to end the war. The United States had been at war for nearly 4 years. Families were exhausted. Soldiers were exhausted. The public wanted closure. Every month the war continued meant more deaths, not only on the battlefield, but from bombing, hunger, and disease. President Truman had been in office only a short time. The weight of the decision fell on a leader who had not even been president when the war began. There was no appetite for a prolonged invasion that could stretch into 1946 or beyond. Ending the war quickly was not just a military goal. It was a political necessity. The Japanese leadership deadlock. One of the most misunderstood aspects of the atomic decision is the state of Japan's internal leadership. Japan was not unified. Some leaders wanted to surrender. Others demanded continued resistance. The military leadership believed that inflicting enough casualties during an invasion could force the United States into a negotiated settlement, one that preserved the existing political system. This belief created a deadlock. No single event short of total catastrophe appeared capable of breaking it. American leaders concluded that conventional bombing, no matter how devastating, was not enough. Something fundamentally different was required. Something shocking. The Soviet Union. The clock was ticking. Another factor accelerated everything. The Soviet Union was preparing to enter the war against Japan. American leaders knew that once Soviet troops moved into Asia, the post-war map would change. Territory mattered. Occupation meant influence. And influence meant ideology. The United States had already watched Eastern Europe fall behind a new political boundary. They did not want Japan, or parts of Asia, divided the same way. Ending the war before the Soviet advance became a strategic priority. The atomic bomb offered a way to do that. The Manhattan Project, a weapon that already existed. The atomic bomb was not created to end the Pacific War. It was created out of fear that Nazi Germany might build it first. By 1945, Germany was defeated. But the weapon existed. Billions of dollars had been spent. Entire cities had been built in secrecy. Thousands of scientists had devoted years of their lives. The weapon worked. And that fact changed the moral equation. For decision-makers, the question was no longer whether the bomb could be used. It was whether not using it, and allowing a massive invasion instead, was morally defensible. The final decision. The decision to use the atomic bomb was not made lightly. It was made under pressure. Pressure from military planners. Pressure from political realities. Pressure from the sheer scale of death already unfolding. From the perspective of U.S. leadership in 1945, the bomb was seen as a way to end the war quickly, a way to avoid an invasion, a way to limit total casualties, a way to shape the post-war world. Whether those assumptions were correct is still debated. But this is the context in which the decision was made. And once the decision was made, there was no turning back. Because the moment the bomb was dropped, the world entered a new era, one defined not by armies or borders, but by the permanent possibility of total destruction. And in the next section, we confront what that decision actually unleashed, not in theory, but in human reality. When the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on the morning of August 6, 1945, there was no frame of reference for what was about to happen. No weapon in human history had ever combined heat, pressure, radiation, and scale in a single instant. The people of Hiroshima did not hear a warning siren. They did not see incoming bombers at low altitude. They did not know that, in the seconds before the blast, the future of warfare and human survival was about to change forever. The moment of detonation. At approximately 8:15 a.m., the bomb detonated nearly 2,000 feet above the city. This was intentional. Airburst detonation maximized destruction across a wide area, rather than creating a deep crater. In less than 1 second, the temperature near the center of the explosion reached levels comparable to the surface of the sun. Anything directly beneath the blast was exposed to heat so intense that solid materials ignited instantly. Human beings closest to the center were killed before their brains could register pain. Some were vaporized. Others were carbonized where they stood. Shadows were burned into stone staircases and walls. Permanent silhouettes left behind when a human body blocked the thermal flash for a fraction of a second. These were not artistic impressions. They were physical records of people who ceased to exist in an instant. The thermal flash, heat without escape. The initial flash of heat traveled outward at the speed of light. It did not discriminate. Skin exposed even miles away suffered severe burns. Clothing ignited, would burst into flames. Hair caught fire. Many survivors later described feeling as if the sun itself had descended into the city. Third-degree burns covered exposed skin. In some cases, skin peeled away simply from movement. People ran toward rivers, canals, and wells, desperate for relief, unaware that the water itself had been contaminated by fallout. Firestorms erupted across the city as thousands of individual blazes merged into walls of flame. In many areas, Oxygen was consumed so rapidly that people suffocated even if they had not been burned. The pressure wave, a city collapses. Following the flash came the blast. A shock wave of compressed air flattened buildings in every direction. Concrete structures crumbled. Wooden homes disintegrated. Glass shattered into high-speed projectiles that sliced through bodies. People were thrown across streets. Trams were overturned. Factories collapsed on workers inside. Those sheltering indoors were often crushed by falling roofs or buried under debris. The city's infrastructure, hospitals, fire stations, water systems, was destroyed almost instantly. Medical care did not just become overwhelmed. It effectively ceased to exist. Immediate casualties, death on an unprecedented scale. Estimates vary, but within the first day alone, tens of thousands were dead. By the end of the first few months, total deaths in Hiroshima reached between 70,000 and 140,000. Nagasaki, bombed 3 days later, added tens of thousands more. Many victims died not instantly, but slowly, from burns, injuries, infections, and radiation sickness that doctors had never seen before. Survivors wandered through ruins searching for family members who no longer existed. Children called out for parents who would never answer. Entire neighborhoods vanished. In some cases, only fragments of personal items remained: a watch, a lunchbox, a shoe. Time stopped. Clocks frozen by the blast still mark the exact moment the bomb exploded. Black rain, the poison that fell from the sky. Hours after the explosion, a strange phenomenon occurred. Dark, oily rain began to fall. This, black rain, was made of radioactive soot, dust, and debris sucked into the atmosphere by the blast and mixed with water vapor. It coated survivors. It soaked into clothing. It collected in wells and streams. People drank it. Children played in it. They had no idea it was lethal. Radiation exposure compounded injuries already suffered from burns and trauma. Those who initially survived began to fall ill within days. Acute radiation sickness. Doctors were unprepared for what they were seeing. Patients experienced nausea and vomiting, hair loss and clumps, internal bleeding, high fevers, severe weakness. Many who appeared relatively unharmed died weeks later. Blood counts dropped. Immune systems collapsed. Minor infections became fatal. Physicians could not explain why wounds that should have healed instead worsened. The concept of radiation poisoning was still poorly understood. Treatment was guesswork. The collapse of medical response. Hospitals were destroyed. Doctors were killed or injured. Supplies were incinerated. Those who could still work faced thousands of wounded with almost nothing to help them. Patients lay on floors. Burn victims were untreated. Pain relief was scarce. Some doctors later described the experience as trying to treat an entire city with the resources of a single clinic. And then came Nagasaki. Nagasaki, a different bomb, the same outcome. On August 9, 1945, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. This bomb used a different design. It was more powerful, but terrain limited its reach. Hills partially contained the blast. Even so, destruction was immense. Factories were destroyed. Residential districts were erased. Thousands were killed instantly. The message was unmistakable. This was not a one-time event. It was a new capability. The human reality behind the numbers. Statistics fail to capture the true impact. Survivors described wandering through landscapes that looked like another planet. Skin hung from arms. Eyes were burned blind. Bodies lined the streets. Silence replaced the sound of life. Many survivors were children. Many were elderly. Many were civilians who had never held a weapon. Families were erased in seconds. Entire bloodlines ended. The moment Japan surrendered. 6 days after Hiroshima. 3 days after Nagasaki. Japan announced its surrender. For American leaders, the war was over. For survivors, the suffering was just beginning. Because survival did not mean recovery. It meant living with invisible damage that would surface years, even decades, later. And in the next section, we explore what the bomb left behind after the smoke cleared. Not just in bodies, but in minds, in families, and in the world itself. When the fires finally burned out in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world assumed the damage was finished. Cities could be rebuilt. Rubble could be cleared. Wars, after all, had ended before. But the atomic bomb did something no previous weapon had ever done. It kept killing long after the explosion. The survivors did not just live with memories of the blast. They lived with a new, invisible enemy inside their bodies and a permanent mark on their lives that followed them for decades. The hibakusha, living with the aftermath. The Japanese word hibakusha means bomb-affected people. It refers to those who survived the atomic bombings. But survival came with a cost. Many hibakusha initially appeared healthy. They returned to daily life. They tried to rebuild homes, families, and routines. Then, months, sometimes years, later, the consequences appeared. Radiation sickness that never ended. Radiation exposure doesn't behave like a burn or a wound. It damages cells at the molecular level. DNA itself is altered. Cells that should repair the body instead malfunction, multiply incorrectly, or die entirely. For hibakusha, this meant long-term medical effects that no one fully understood at the time. Leukemia and blood disorders. One of the first patterns doctors noticed was leukemia. About 2 years after the bombings, rates began to rise. By 6 years post-blast, leukemia cases among survivors peaked. Children exposed to radiation were especially vulnerable. Many who seemed fine in 1945 were diagnosed in the early 1950s. Families watched loved ones waste away without understanding why. There were no cures. There were no specialized treatments. Medicine was learning in real time, at the expense of human lives. Solid tumors and organ damage. As decades passed, other cancers emerged. Thyroid cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, stomach cancer. Survivors exposed closer to ground zero showed dramatically higher rates. Radiation didn't just cause cancer. It accelerated aging, weakened organs, and reduced immune response. Some hibakusha lived with chronic fatigue and illness for the rest of their lives. Cataracts and vision loss. Ionizing radiation damaged eye tissue. Many survivors developed cataracts years later. Some lost vision entirely. For them, the bomb continued to take, even as they aged. Pregnancy, children, and fear of the future. One of the most haunting fears among survivors was not what had happened to them, but what might happen to their children. Pregnant women exposed to radiation worried constantly. Would their babies be born healthy? Would radiation affect future generations? While large-scale genetic damage was less widespread than initially feared, the fear itself became a lifelong burden. Parents watched children grow with anxiety. Every illness sparked terror. Every delay raised questions. Psychological trauma, the invisible wound. Long before the term PTSD existed, hibakusha were living with it. Survivors experienced nightmares, flashbacks, chronic anxiety, depression, survivor's guilt. Many asked the same question for decades. Why did I live when everyone else died? Entire families had vanished. Children grew up without parents. Parents lived knowing they outlived their children. Some survivors never spoke about the bomb again. Others spoke endlessly, trying to make sense of something that defied explanation. Social stigma and discrimination. Perhaps one of the most painful long-term effects was how survivors were treated by their own society. Hibakusha were often feared. People worried radiation was contagious. Employers avoided hiring them. Families refused marriage proposals involving hibakusha. Women especially faced discrimination, as potential spouses feared birth defects. Many survivors hid their history. They concealed their scars. They stayed silent, not because they wanted to, but because speaking meant exclusion. The world responds. Science meets morality. As years passed, international attention turned to the bombings, not just as military events, but as scientific and ethical turning points. Medical researchers studied hibakusha to understand radiation's effects. This research contributed to modern oncology and radiation safety standards. But it came with moral discomfort. The survivors were not volunteers. They were unwilling participants in history's largest human radiation study, the dawn of the nuclear age. While survivors struggled to rebuild their lives, the world moved in a different direction. The atomic bomb was no longer a secret. It was a blueprint. Other nations raced to build their own. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in 1949. The nuclear arms race had begun. Weapons grew more powerful. Hydrogen bombs followed, hundreds of times stronger than those dropped on Japan. Humanity entered a new era where war could mean extinction. The Cold War and permanent fear. For decades, nuclear weapons defined global politics. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills. Cities built fallout shelters. Governments planned for scenarios where millions would die in minutes. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols, warnings etched into history. The nuclear taboo. Ironically, the horror of the bombings helped prevent future use. The world collectively recognized something profound. These weapons were different. They crossed a moral line. Since 1945, nuclear weapons have never again been used in war. This unspoken agreement became known as the nuclear taboo. It exists not because nuclear war is impossible, but because humanity has already seen the cost, memory, responsibility, and the question that remains. Today, many Hibakusha are gone. Those still alive are elderly, but their stories remain. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki stand rebuilt, vibrant, modern, alive. Yet beneath the surface lies a question that still has no final answer. Was the bomb a tragic necessity, or a warning humanity barely heeded? And if such weapons exist, can they ever truly be controlled? By the time the second atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki, the world had crossed a line it could never uncross. From that moment forward, war was no longer limited by distance, manpower, or time. It was limited only by restraint. To understand why the nuclear age unfolded the way it did, we need to look closely at the two bombs themselves, what made them different, and why their use reshaped global power forever. Because Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just tragedies. They were proof of concept. Two bombs, two designs, one message. The atomic bombs dropped on Japan were not identical. They represented two different technological approaches to the same terrifying goal, releasing the energy locked inside the atom. Little boy Hiroshima. The first bomb, dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, was nicknamed Little Boy. Its design was relatively simple by nuclear standards. It used uranium-235 and worked like a gun. One piece of uranium was fired into another, creating a critical mass and triggering a nuclear chain reaction. It had never been tested before. Scientists were confident it would work, but there was no real-world proof until Hiroshima vanished in a flash of light. The explosion released energy equivalent to roughly 15,000 tons of TNT. The city below ceased to exist in seconds. Hiroshima became the first place in human history destroyed by a nuclear weapon. Fat Man, Nagasaki. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. This one was called Fat Man. It used plutonium-239 and relied on a far more complex implosion design. Instead of firing material together, explosives compressed plutonium inward until it reached critical mass. This design had been tested weeks earlier in the New Mexico desert during the Trinity test. Its yield was larger, roughly 20,000 tons of TNT. Geography spared Nagasaki from even worse destruction, but the human cost was still catastrophic. Two cities, two designs, one message. Humanity had unlocked a power it barely understood. Why two bombs? This question has lingered for decades. Why not stop after Hiroshima? Why Nagasaki? From a strategic standpoint, U.S. leaders believed speed mattered. They feared Japan might not surrender immediately. They worried that hesitation would allow hardliners within the Japanese government to delay, regroup, or escalate. They also wanted undeniable proof, not of one weapon, but of a new category of warfare. The second bomb removed any doubt that Hiroshima was a fluke. It demonstrated that nuclear destruction could be repeated. And it worked. Japan announced its surrender days later. World War II was over. But something else had begun. The immediate global reaction. News of the atomic bomb spread fast. Governments around the world understood instantly that military power had changed forever. Traditional armies, fleets, and fortifications were suddenly obsolete. One bomb could do what thousands of planes and soldiers could not. The United States emerged from the war with unprecedented power, not just military, but psychological. But that dominance would not last. The Soviet response and the arms race. The Soviet Union had been watching closely. They accelerated their own nuclear program. Just 4 years later, in 1949, the USSR detonated its first atomic bomb. The balance of power shifted overnight. The world entered a new era defined by one phrase: mutually assured destruction. If one nuclear power launched an attack, the other could respond. No one would win. Everyone would lose. This fragile balance became the foundation of global security for decades. Peace was no longer maintained by trust, but by fear. From atomic bombs to apocalypse weapons, the bombs dropped on Japan were small by later standards. Soon came hydrogen bombs, weapons that used fusion instead of fission. They were hundreds, then thousands of times more powerful. Entire regions could be erased. Civilization itself became fragile. Military planners no longer asked how to win wars. They asked how to survive them. Hiroshima and Nagasaki as warnings, not just history. Over time, the bombings took on new meaning. They were no longer viewed only as military decisions. They became moral reference points. Every nuclear policy debate returned to those cities. Every discussion of deterrence carried their shadows. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became living reminders of what nuclear war actually looks like. Not on paper, not in simulations, but in human lives. The nuclear taboo, an unwritten rule. Since 1945, nuclear weapons have never been used again in war. This is not because they disappeared. It is because something called the nuclear taboo took hold. A shared understanding that using these weapons would cross a line too terrible to accept. This taboo is not guaranteed. It relies on restraint, on memory, on leaders remembering what happened when the atom was unleashed on a city. The final question. The atomic bomb ended World War II, but it also created a world where humanity lives under a constant, silent threat. A world where extinction is no longer theoretical. It's engineered. So the question we are left with is not just about the past. It's about the future. If these weapons exist, if they can be built, rebuilt, and multiplied, can humanity rely forever on restraint? Or was Hiroshima not the end of a war, but the beginning of a test we are still taking? And the real question may be this. Have we learned enough to never do it again? Or just enough to do it better? Don't forget to subscribe on your way out. See you next video.